one of the things that really distinguishes Ratzinger's thought, as I've noticed really trying to immerse myself in it for a couple decades, is he's always trying to get to the core, the kernel of an issue. And you sense that he is answering particular questions. It seems like it's things he himself has had the question, or he's been asked by a student. He's trying to answer it. He has an uncanny, I would say, unmatched ability to see through all of the fluff, get to the heart of it, take the best of the ancient, take the best of the modern, wed them together into a coherent unity that respects the tradition while not being ossified, but really letting that tradition be brought to bear and to be developed, as Newman would say, in light of what we know today.
Hi, welcome to the Catholic Scientist Podcast. It's a production of the Society of Catholic Scientists. I am your host, Dr. Dan Keebler. Dr. Stephen Barr, the co-host, is not able to be here today on this episode, but we are excited to have on this episode a theologian, Dr. Matthew Ramage. He is a systematic, he has his PhD in systematic theology from Ave Maria University. And he also got a master's in theology from Franciscan University, where I teach. And he is currently at Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. And he's a professor of theology there. And he's also co-director of the Center for Integral Ecology at Benedictine. And he's written a number of books. We're going to talk specifically about two of them today. And then we're also going to talk at the end of the podcast about the latest project he has. The Two Books Project is the website he's building, and a project he has to generate what he describes as a global hub for engaging creation from the heart of the Catholic Church. And so speak to that in due time. So Dr. Ramage, welcome to the podcast.
Great to see you again, Dan. Good to be here.
Yeah, that's great. I was able to get out and to Benedictine. I've been here Franciscan 25 years now. I had never been to Benedictine College. I was able to get out there this past year. It was really, really nice to see Matthew and his colleagues there, and see the university and see what they have going on there. So I was really impressed with Benedictine.
You know, it was a blessed conversation that was had on campus. People are still talking about it. So thanks for coming.
Oh, great. And we're looking forward to, we're going to have Dr. Ramage here at Franciscan in the fall of 2026. So that's going to be nice as well. So maybe we can just start, get the listeners to know a little bit about you. You are an associate member of the Society of Catholic Scientists. You've been to a few meetings, and but what got you interested in theology first, and then what got you interested within theology to engage with Benedict's thought, and then also science and theology? So it's a long.
Yeah, for theology in general, it was just simply love of God and just wanting to know more and not being satisfied with the answers I would get when I asked people questions.
Yeah.
So I think for a lot of theologians, it's like this. It's the search for truth and this restlessness that leads you on to the inquiry, and hopefully, again, also paired with love of God. But like many, I began college as a pre-med, bio major. And part of it actually was I wasn't at Franciscan University, and the biologists and physicists and chemists I was taking classes from really segregated science from everything else. And in some cases had scientism as their background and their assumptions. And so I would just run up against questions. I think of one like, well, okay, we just memorize these molecules, but why? And I was never against science, but I went through this phase where I got away from it because I thought theology is the highest science. We don't need that, empiricals. But then eventually I circled back. It really came through teaching college students who would come to me with questions. So much of my writing, it turns out, and I've been at Benedictine the better part of 20 years now, has stemmed from, hey, someone told me you can't believe in faith and evolution together, and so those sorts of questions prompted not only courses I've taught and lectures, but entire books. Ultimately, though, it was all about love. Really, I just love creation. Having kids helped with this. Getting
Yeah, yeah.
out there, cheap ways to entertain the family, going to state or national parks. Um, so it's been beautiful, especially the last 15 years or so, to come back to faith and science now with hopefully enough scientific background, but with the expertise in theology, and therefore it's neat to see the other side of the coin, right? Like with you, and obviously we can't do it all, but we can learn enough of the other discipline to be conversant.
Right. Yeah. No, that's so true. And I think I came into the science and faith field in the similar way through student questions in my science class about bioethical issues, about evolution, and so forth. And I'm like, well, yeah, I sort of know these as a Catholic, but I need to dive into these more. And so turning to books and articles and talking more importantly to actual theologians and philosophers here at Franciscan or at elsewhere, yourself at Benedictine, other people at like Notre Dame, and learning from theologians and philosophers, so that then I could talk intelligently across disciplines about these. But it really came from, like you're saying, the student questions, because you want to get at the truth and you want to help students get at the truth, and so you want to guide them. And so the better equipping myself to be able to guide them is what got me into this. And it sounds like that had a big role in moving you back into the science.
Yeah, and you know what? Being attacked for it too doesn't hurt.
Yeah,
As
yeah, yeah.
uh, my engagement with biology, my freshman year of high school, ironically, we had a biologist who was a fundamentalist and anti-evolutionist. I probably didn't even know the word evolution until ninth grade, but he just came out swinging against it. So then, I even had some meager awareness of the church's teaching, but I knew that wasn't right. And then in college, you got the opposite view at a secular institution. Um, and then you come back to the Catholic environment we're in now, and sometimes you'll just be holding the church's basic position and be attacked for it by Catholics.
Yeah.
So that's actually lit another fire. We want to bring orthodoxy in a dynamic way, and engage what's actually the Catholic view, and not the podcast. Here we are, right? But not the random podcaster's view. And that's, of course, what the SCS does too. The SCS is grounded in the actual teaching of the church, and not just doing an ad hoc kind of statement of what they happen to think.
Right. Yeah, exactly. No, that's a great point. And that's, the SCS is that we're coming from the heart of the church. I think that's your new website, coming from the heart of the church, and saying, okay, how do we use that to understand these questions and probe these questions? It's not what Dan Keebler thinks about this. This is like what does the church think, and maybe some insights that other people have to and every once in a while an insight that might come through me, but that goes along with the heart of the church. It's not trying to come up with my own theology about
Mhm.
creation, right? So along those lines, your latest book, I love it. I highly recommend it to anybody. This is the Essential Guide to Ratzinger, the man and his message. Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger, I think one of the brightest theologians that the church has seen in a long time, and particularly on science and faith issues, but on issue after issue, I think
Mhm.
he's a great guide to how to think about issues from a Catholic perspective.
Yes.
But what inspired you to? I know you've studied and been deeply interested in his theological writing for years, but what got you to write this book? And is it something you've been working on for a while? Is it something like because you've been working on Ratzinger for so long, this was something you were able to put together pretty quickly?
Yeah, actually, the book itself I wrote in less than 6 months, but in a way, I've been working on it since 1999 or 2000. And I first encountered Ratzinger in college because in those days, he was the hero of people who wanted to be Orthodox. Sometimes I have to remind my students of this because they don't know him any more than I knew anything about Paul VI, because Pope JP2 had been the Pope my whole life, basically. And so whenever I had a question, he always seemed to have the answer. And and of course, being young and maybe not the most nuanced, we loved it that he would have his Ratzingers and he would smack down heresy and all these sorts of things. Well, it turns out he's a lot more nuanced than people think. He's not simply a heresy slapper. But he, like his predecessor, was not afraid to do that when necessary. But it's just that he always seemed to have a powerful, orthodox, compelling, and life-giving thing to say. And it really, intellectual as it is, it boiled down to friendship with Jesus. So it was also very relatable. I was actually reminded of this recently. I love John Paul II, but I was assigning the theology of the body I hadn't read for a while, and I had forgotten just how spiral, circular he is. And when you spend most of your time in Ratzinger, there's a contrast. So each has their gift, but Ratzinger is always just crisp and clear and to the point, why a lot of people find him so compelling, I think.
Yeah, it's that's great. Ratzinger, he wrote a lot on science and faith, but he also, wrote the book on just Christ and what Jesus is and what he means to the world. And so what is, your book, you say the man and his message. If you were to say what is at the heart of his message, you say a relationship with Christ. Is that what you would say, or is there something?
I mean, it really does boil down to that in the end, that it's all about relationship with Christ. I mean, and that's one of like the last words he said, I love you, Jesus. And it's relationship with Christ and therefore immersion in the life of the Trinity. So his whole approach is Trinitarian. It's Christocentric. Like John Paul II is sometimes described as personalist, because the way he'll phrase things, like JP2, it's consistent with your Aquinas or your Bonaventures of the world, but it would put in relational terms. I'm sure we'll get into this later with evolution out, so I'll hold my thoughts on that particular point. But one of the things that really distinguishes Ratzinger's thought, as I've noticed really trying to immerse myself in it for a couple decades, is he's always trying to get to the core, the kernel of an issue. And you sense that he is answering particular questions. It seems like it's things he himself has had the question, or he's been asked by a student. He's trying to answer it. Whether it's how do we still maintain religious freedom? How can Vatican II say we have religious freedom when a previous pope says we didn't? Or the biblical discovery about which author wrote what gospel is different maybe than what they thought 150 years ago. Those sorts of issues and liturgy and more. He has an uncanny, I would say, unmatched ability to see through all of the fluff, get to the heart of it, take the best of the ancient, take the best of the modern, wed them together into a coherent unity that respects the tradition while not being ossified, but really letting that tradition be brought to bear and to be developed, as Newman would say, in light of what we know today. So that's some of the most compelling things I find about Ratzinger.
Yeah, that's great. Is that something that you can give us an example, maybe with the liturgy or with some aspect where you see this like concrete?
Yeah, the liturgy is a great example, and of course, this was sort of different story under Francis's pontificate. But Benedict, with his document Summorum Pontificum, he wanted to allow more traditional liturgy. He wanted to allow the Tridentine Mass, but he still held that the Novus Ordo was the default. So a lot of people have these liturgy wars.
Right.
I'm sure your campus has them, like I see it around here sometimes. But he wanted a mutual enrichment of both. Like the Novus Ordo, we have a much richer calendar of readings. There's something to the tune of 80% more scripture we get to engage. But there are other aspects, like Gregorian chants say. A lot of people don't realize Vatican II itself said that was the normative music, and the organ is the normative
Right.
instrument. And in fact, the default language of the Novus Ordo is Latin. So he wanted to incorporate both. And I won't derail us into a liturgy debate, right? But it's a good example. Biblical interpretation is another, probably even better example. This is where I spend a lot of time because I'm a systematic theologian, but I also did biblical studies. You had to pick one or the other, but I had the credits for both. So biblical studies, a lot of us really saw him as a model and continue to, because he loves the fathers. But he also recognizes they don't have the tools to answer certain questions. Once evolution comes on the scene, you need to be able to bring modern sources to bear, and God bless them. They're more intelligent, holier probably, and better at the Bible and knowing Christ through it than most of us. But the fathers didn't have modern archaeology. They didn't have an idea of the context of Genesis, what it was really responding to with the Babylonians. And I'm sure, I know you've read Ratzinger's homilies in the beginning. He brings these things up in there, and that's something the fathers were not able to do. So he doesn't just buy into every modern hypothesis, but he takes those discoveries and brings them to light with the help of the tradition and vice versa.
Yeah, no, that's so important because it is. It's like you seem like in the church a lot of times you have these wars between, oh, the tradition has it and we should just follow the tradition. It's got everything. Oh, hey, there's a new way of doing things. We just do everything new. And it's like, no, the synthesis of those things, and it actually takes a lot of hard work. And that's the thing I think why people like to follow one of the other camps, because
it is more now than ever in the
Yeah.
internet age.
Yeah.
When if you want more clicks and therefore more money, the extreme the better, And Chesterton put his finger on this 100 years ago. He has a lot of little Chesterton isms, but if you're in the middle and you're being attacked from both sides, you're probably in the right position.
Yeah.
But the balanced, sober reasoning is not always attractive to people because it's not admitting of a quick answer.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So I'll need you to say some things that are a little more controversial so we get some more clicks on the podcast.
Yeah.
Well, let's look at another book that you wrote, and again, it's on Benedict. So continuing on the thought of Benedict, this is the one about evolution from the dust of the earth. This is Benedict XVI, the Bible and the theory of evolution, and so. In this book, you go into, scriptural interpretation, you go into how do we understand evolution, how do we understand the human person, and all with an eye towards sort of how Benedict approaches this. So maybe you could just sort of like frame, how does Benedict look at and try to understand evolution? What's his sort of guiding principles that he might have?
Yeah, and by way of preface to that, it's probably worth pointing out, the reason I wrote that book over about 10-year period is people always wonder, what authority do you turn to? And we only really have one encyclical on basically that deals with evolution. And you have that series through Steubenville on the anniversary here of Humani Generis. But if you really want to know what the church thinks, Ratzinger is the best place to look, because he has the wisdom, even especially as Pope, to not declare any scientific doctrine, because that's not within the purview of faith. But over a period of 50 years, he addressed this subject as a priest at Vatican II, as a bishop, as a cardinal, as a pope. And it's just remarkable. So Cardinal Schönborn once said, if you really want to know what the church's position is on a given topic, you're not going to find a better place than Ratzinger, because he had a hand in Vatican II's documents. He was the head of the Congregation for Doctrine and Faith under JP2 for decades, and then he was Pope. So I think by way of preface, that's significant because what he's going to say will not be infallible, but it is incredibly traditional, grounded in that, while he brings it up to date. So like his basic position then is, he says at one point, we can't say creation or evolution. What we should be saying is creation and evolution, because they respond to two different questions. And I just had a student in my office an hour ago, come to think of it, about this. He says in one essay, creation moves at the level of the ontological, and evolution at the level of the phenomenological, the empirical. And like his predecessor said, we need to have a relational unity. There should be a conversation between the two. But on the other hand, each, in a way, should stay in its own lane. And so the theologian, one of my mentors used to say, should not dictate to the scientist ahead of time what his conclusions are. Just as the scientist should not be doing theology in the way that Richard Dawkins would do.
Yeah.
When you bear in mind that both have unique questions they're answering, then you get to say not God or evolution, but God creating through evolution. And he was very convinced about this. There's a line I translated this summer for one of my Catholic World Report posts. He was talking with the atheist mathematician Orifredi, who was criticizing the church on evolution. And Benedict said, no serious theologian would deny that life has a common origin. I don't know that all theologians would agree with that statement, but it shows you his view, though.
Yeah.
So it's very telling about his perspective.
You talk about evolution and creation, how Benedict says, yeah, it's a both and, right? But there are some quotes that he has, and I've had people, put these up and say, well, look, he's not really all in on evolution. He says things that are more akin to like an intelligent design position, that God has to intervene at some points in the evolutionary process to get things moving, right? Obviously, God has to intervene in the creation of the immaterial human soul, but there's other aspects that God has to intervene in, where things like natural process couldn't produce this complex organ or something like that. So there's one quote that Benedict has. It says, "In the beginning, the creative word, this word that created all things, created this intelligent design, which is the cosmos," right? And some people think, oh, he must be an intelligent design person. And he's also made quotes about there's some fuzziness about whether micro versus macro evolution, like this transition where macro evolution might be harder to explain. So people say, well, he's not really all in on evolution per se. What would be your response to someone that would say that, given the mounds of evidence you put forth in your book about he really seriously engaging this topic?
Yeah, it is interesting. It's like one or two lines compared to thousands of lines. It, very much reminds me in a weird way of the transgender issue I was just teaching in my theological anthropology. So you have a couple of ambiguous cases of gender, and that does not mean that gender is completely fluid. In fact, Abigail Favale's book, she illumined me on this, because she really said, actually, if you get down to it, it's not ambiguous if you know what you're looking for. There are no ambiguous cases. But the reason I brought that up is you might have two pieces of evidence, and then you have 100,000 pieces of evidence, and somehow the two pieces become determinative. That's, I think, what's going on here.
Right.
But to address the actual two pieces of evidence sort of thing, though, it is fascinating that he uses the term intelligent design. And it's not so much remarkable in its own sake, so much as that intelligent design on the internet has become associated with a particular version of creationism. And they've won the rhetorical battle on that, if you will. So what I try to help students see is, yeah, we teach intelligent design. But what we mean by that, and what Ratzinger means by it here, is that fundamentally the cosmos is rational.
Right. Yeah, that's great.
It proceeds from the logos. So of course it's an intelligent design, but it's more intelligent than people think, because, and this connects with the Thomistic concept of secondary causality that I know you deal with, that Steve Barr does, and he has some great analogies for that. But Ratzinger doesn't use the Thomistic phrasing secondary causality, but it's exactly what he means, because he actually sees God as more intelligent and glorified because he creates through creatures. He gives them being. That's technically creation. And then he governs the universe, providence, through creatures, so that I like to tell my students, well, at a very basic level, who's a better fisherman? The guy who can go catch 20 fish and know where to look, or the guy who can do that and teach his kids to do it? And he can sit back and drink a beer while they catch some of the fish for him. And the idea here is, Aquinas says it's one thing to be good in itself, but there's a greater perfection when you communicate that goodness to others so that they can be causes. And what we have is, a lot of people think, well, then God's not present. He just let creatures do it. But that assumes the either or of God or creatures, whereas in truth, God is ever present. He's more intimate to me than I am to myself, like Augustine says. He's upholding me existence, giving me the very nature with its abilities to be a cause. So it's always both and, Steve talks about horizontal and vertical causality.
Yeah.
God is giving me that ability while I act out in the world to be able to make legitimate, beautiful changes within it.
Yeah, that's one of the things you mentioned earlier, how he gets to the heart of the matter really quickly. And I think in his evolution writing, the heart of the matter is, at the beginning, was there reason or was there irrationality, right? And that is, like, there's a reason and there's order at the very beginning. And so it doesn't matter how things unfolded. There's reason from the very start and all the way through creation. And so there's got to be a source of that reason, right? And I think that is that, do you see that as sort of the question that the answer he keeps coming back to, and it's sort of what it pivots on,
Yeah, it is. And in his homilies on Genesis, that's the thing, right, that distinguishes the biblical account fundamentally. It's not the only thing, but fundamentally from the Babylonians, their accounts of creation that predate it. It's chaos, and the world comes to being through the war between gods. But the Logos, although he's pre-incarnate still, he is creating the world. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, all three act in union. And they create through speech, which is a figure, as the fathers would say, a metaphorical idiom for his reason. So that is the central key for Ratzinger. Now, then, like you mentioned, he does actually raise the question, well, it's not always abundantly clear, this micro macro level. Some people use that as an excuse. I know you've seen it a million times, that, well, microevolution, little genetic changes can occur, but you can't have species change. Whereas, at least in this theologian's understanding of things, macro is just micro on a longer time frame. And, well, I think it's good that Ratzinger, he did actually raise the question, like, we've not mapped this out. So I do like one thing about the intelligent design movement as it currently exists that has a commonality with this one point of Ratzinger, is just to remind us to have some epistemic humility, that we're never going to fully explain really much of anything, because every time you provide an explanation, you just create two more gaps. But the problem is, a lot of people think, I'm never going to be convinced until I have this next piece of evidence. But the mounds and mounds we have, Newman would say, at a certain point, it takes more faith to believe the opposite view. And you end up having to contradict faith and science. You have to end up saying that fundamentally man's intellect does not have the capacity to grasp reality. And that's a concern of Ratzinger's, because he thinks, because God's the Logos, matter, even before it's living, is fundamentally intelligible. So it's very important that man can grasp that structure of the universe, and that it doesn't need to be interrupted as it evolves. because it is intelligently designed. He'll act through it. If I may, Dan, there's an analogy I thought Jen and I had made up, and then it so happens Steve Barr had this in his book, which was kind of cool. But if you think of God as an author, um, I want to go a specific direction with this. You know, a person is not a good author when they write their book or their TV series. Let's use TV series. They get to the
Yeah.
end of the TV series and they can't bring it to a resolution without a deus ex machina move that's inconsistent with the plot.
Right.
And God is the author of creation. One of the beautiful parts about evolution is the plot works. Anyway, I hope that's an illuminating analogy.
Yeah, no, that is, and I think it's the thing that Benedict, it talks about that God is imminently in creation at each and every moment, and it's not, oh, we got to find a spot for God in creation,
Yeah,
is a fundamental misunderstanding, right? And you talk about this false dichotomy between God and nature, right? And the Catholic view of nature as opposed to like a secular view of nature, right? Where nature has its own autonomy and its own structure. And then there's God over there on the side competing with that, right?
yeah,
And that leads to that type of a belief that if we can figure out how nature works or natural processes work, God gets squeezed out when in fact that's not at all how God operates. Right?
exactly. No, I think that when we resort to really hanging our hat on this organ cannot have evolved or this molecule, then we're open to falsification and quite likely will be someday. So, people I've heard say before the wing can't have evolved, or the eye. And at least in my reading, there are very plausible mechanisms and actual fossil data and more data beyond that to demonstrate it. So the Thomist in me says, why would you even go that route when the real proofs for God and the reason we believe in him are much more fundamental? They don't depend upon microscopes, telescopes, and genetics. Those all can give greater glory. We see his beauty thanks to these, but it's a confusion between theology and science when we're trying to prove God on this empirical level.
Yeah, yeah. So people get that term intelligent design. That term. In a sense, Catholics, we are intelligent designers by nature because we think that through reason and rational arguments we can come to the conclusion that God exists, right? But those are not scientific arguments or scientific data that we're using. Think of like Aquinas's five ways. And so forth. They're something deeper and more fundamental, as you say. And I
Mm-hmm.
think people get those. I think that's why when you hear the term intelligent design, people are like, "Yeah, that seems reasonable." Yeah, as a Catholic, that seems like how I would fall in that, and they don't realize the nature of the argument.
Yeah, and not all intelligent design arguments out there are the same anyway. In my neck of the woods, all people use it to reject evolution as a whole. But then there are writers on it who say we don't reject evolution. We just don't think God, we think he had to intervene, in these
Yeah,
ways. And so those aren't even the same. So it is, unfortunately, like many things, a linguistic battle as well. It's like in biblical scholarship. I was just reading JP2 yesterday about the myth of the rib of Eve. And no doubt about it, Benedict and John Paul, along with many other great thinkers like Tolkien and Lewis. Lewis is Catholic. I mean, not Catholic, but he's pretty close.
yeah,
Chesterton. They'll look at Genesis as myth, but our society thinks myth equals falsehood,
right.
not the illumination of the imagination to find God as those authors see it. And so, in a similar way, intelligent design, you have to define things for people. And that's one of those things I try to do. Okay, what does literal sense mean? It doesn't mean video camera. It means the literary sense. What's myth mean? Not falsehood. And I just do the same thing with intelligent design.
Yeah. No, there's so many things that when it comes down to these arguments, people are talking past each other because they're using words in ways that are not the same. Yeah. So one of the things in your book on the on evolution of the dust of the earth, you talk about evolution as being like a melody, right? A symphony,
Mhm.
rather than, there's this atheistic idea that it's just some blind process and these organisms are being cobbled together by chance and so forth. But to see this as more of a melody that's being played. So maybe just sort of unpack for our listeners why you use that analogy and what it gets to.
I first got that from reading Chronicles of Narnia, which I read as an adult, but I remember sitting in my living room in 2008 reading that because my wife is a big fan of Lewis and Tolkien. And so um, Aslan creates the world through song, and the magician's nephew. Tolkien, my wife had me read. I made the mistake of trying to read Tolkien's Silmarillion in the middle of the night over the first year of our first child's life. Um, so I kind of lost the plot. But the first part, he has a creation account through song, and um, and then Ratzinger actually uses this language. I don't think he got it from those authors, but he speaks of creation as a melody or a song. And the more I went on in my research, I saw one of the big patristic themes is creation as the Carmen Dei. Carmen can be translated as poem. Um, and so any liturgical or musical analogy that might work there, some people would prefer a different one. Benedict was into classical music. He uses symphony.
Yeah.
So whichever one uses, I think there are a few key points. And that is, first of all, it's not just truth, it's beauty. So the world is not just rational. It it is a gift of love, and so it's attractive. And that's really fascinating to me for Ratzinger because here you have one of the greatest intellects of the past century. But for him, the greatest arguments for the church and for Christ and for God as a Trinity, he actually says it's the beauty of the church and the saints she has produced. So, with regard to this one, I think first it's the beauty of creation. Secondly, there's something about music that we know it has a certain improvisational quality. And I really like the intimation in there that God gives a certain amount of freedom to the creature. Of course, humans alone have free will, but that, yeah, evolution gets to be a mechanism by which, while not being totally random, there is a certain degree of freedom in the creature to develop itself. And then finally, and maybe along with the beauty, most importantly, the thing that comes to mind is the song requires that the singer be present. So if we contrast the image of creation as a melody with it as a engineered entity, like a house or something, well, the architect and the engineer and all the bricklayers and everybody can go away and leave it alone, and that gives you the impression of deism.
Yeah.
But the melody, you can't go away. Now, I know a person could respond, well, we have tape recorders. Actually, we don't anymore. We have what do you call it?
Something like that.
We have phones. We can
Yeah.
record. But really, you got to have the artist present with it. And this actually fits Aquinas's view. The proofs for God are not that once upon a time he made the world. When Aquinas says you can't have a simultaneous infinite regressive causes, he means right now there has to be a first cause or else there'd be no motion at all. So I just think it's genius that these people, almost independently it seems, converge on music being a fitting analogy for God's operation in the world.
Yeah, no, there's yeah, I love the idea that the creator has to be present. The singer has to be present to the player to make the music, and the God is intimately present throughout it all. It doesn't disappear. But there's also another aspect there that I really like, and that is, music has an order and a structure to it, right? To have
Hmm.
beauty, there's order and structure there. But like
Yeah.
you said, there's improvisation, and there's sort of freedom as you can riff on this or riff on that, and so the creature is able to work within certain parameters to get towards the end that God has deigned, but He's working through and with us, right?
And there's something I know you've touched on before as well that you will put better than I, but as a guitarist, if you want to do a solo, which I am not the best at, but nevertheless, um, you're basing this on scales, and there are already preordained rules you've got to play within. So a solo is never completely random, and I think that is a great analogy for evolution, right? It's You've talked about how there there's only you've seen a independent evolution of different structures because the world is set up by God in such a way that it can only go so many directions. Does that sound somewhat fair to say with
Yeah,
um
based on
yeah.
the chemistry and physics of the universe, like there's only certain things that are going to work, and other things just won't work. There's just certain opportunities are closed, and certain
Hmm.
are robust and open, and evolution seems to find them over and over again. That it's not just
Hmm.
blind, random, anything goes search because of that foundational order. Just like you say, there's a foundational order to the structure plane that's going to limit what you can and can't do in a solo. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's a great. I love that analogy because I think it gets to a lot of the at the heart of what evolution is. But at the heart of evolution and the heart of the debate of evolution usually is human evolution. So I just want to touch on this briefly
Oh
and what
yeah.
Benedict thinks, because that's where people really, I see people just struggle with that sometimes.
Yeah.
There's a honest struggle to see how to fit things together because humans are a unity of body and soul. But how do how do these humans arise via natural process when there's a spiritual dimension to humans, and how do we see that? How does Benedict deal with this? How does he see, because I know he talks about, there's an ontological leap when you come to humans, but how do you have an
Hmm.
ontological leap but also a physical continuity, right? And
Right. It's pretty amazing, right? That phrasing that he and JP2 had, that there is a physical continuity of the body, but an ontological leap, a leap in being. Um, because Benedict was aware of the evidence, and while he's also aware the church is never going to define that humans evolved, he sees the direction it's leaning, and his basic view, which he has written in an essay or two, is that it's analogous to human conception even today. And I think this is really powerful. And I have a PowerPoint. I go through this, and my wife has a neat analogy to add on to it. But the gist of it is that, Jen and I, we helped create 8 kids, but we procreated them. We aren't technically creators because we can't bring something from nothing, but we really did play a role in the beginning of that person. It's not accidental. Um, but sperm and egg are not themselves even potentially a person. So when those two come together and God infuses the soul, we outdo ourselves in a way. God brings about more than we could on our own. So he sees this similar thing with the first humans, is the hominins that preceded us. Um, they really do have a causal role to play. And, you know, if I may, from your book, and again, I may butcher it, but there's an analogy I like. People might struggle with rational humans coming from the pre-rational, but Mary was a human being, and in her womb was an infinitely knowing being. And so the incarnation itself shows us that the lower can become a foundation for the entry of God in the world and the entry of reason in the world. And all this fits with what Benedict says. But he has a line where he says, the marvel is that the soul comes to being not next to, but precisely through the natural processes. And to me, that's marvelous,
Yeah.
because you don't need to find a gap in the chemistry or the biology or whatever level you're looking at. Even if somehow we were to completely map human development in the womb, and the atheist would say, look, you don't need God. We don't want to fall into that error. We don't want to play on their field. If you think in like Aquinas, you would actually marvel all the more because God worked by dignifying the creature as cause.
Yeah. And so all the material causes work sort of in contingent and one after the other, and you see this sort of an uninterrupted thing, but there is, along, embedded in that is the creation of the human soul, right? It's not something that interrupts the natural process, right? That's what he's getting at there. Yeah.
Yeah, and in a very Thomistic way, in his professorial notes, Father Santiago, a priest friend from Rome, and I are doing a book on Ratzinger as a lecturer, where he got more speculative because he didn't have a pastoral obligation. He goes in through all kinds of scholastic formulae to describe this, but the gist of it is that if we think hylomorphically in a traditional Catholic way, the unity of body and soul, matter and form, then a change in the body will be accompanied by a change in the soul and vice versa. So he has some bolder formulations of it, but essentially it's not that you just have a body plucking along and then finally a soul plops in, but the body and soul being intrinsically fitted together. Um, whatever this moment is, if it's a single moment where Adam really is a legitimate, bona fide, rational human being, there would be some bodily disposition that is also occurring. Maybe you wouldn't see it on the outside. Maybe it's a final genetic change. But anyway, that's a Thomistic way of looking at it that I find is, by the way, for listeners, really well done by Father Mariusz Tabachek at the
Yeah.
Angelicum. And if people really want a detailed Thomistic account, there are those out there to be had. But I think that's Ratzinger's basic way of looking at it.
Yeah. And so, what is his view on original sin? Because that's another thing. Like Humani Generis just said, that's the only document we really have to go on that talks about original sin. So, how do you, look at original sin in terms of a human creation in this material world, a world of hominids? Is original sin? Do we have to change our understanding of that, or how does Benedict see that?
Oh yeah, no, that's terrific. 'Cause I think along with the very fact that humans evolved, which rubs people the wrong way, original sin is a big one because you would think, well, wait, if evolution's true, we were created sinful because we know animals do all these actions that would be evil in our species.
Yeah.
Um, so he sees original sin in a very traditional way, in a sense, because he steadfastly holds that the first humans were given grace, that they were not created in sin, and that they did not have to sin. So original justice is maintained by Benedict, where he's going to differ in a way from maybe some more traditional presentations of it is, like JP2, he's a personalist, so he prefers to phrase this in a relational key. And so he speaks of original sin primarily as relationship rupture.
Right. Okay.
And so it's relationship with God first, but then in its wake, all the other relationships fall apart. They're damaged, not completely ruptured like Luther would have it, but they're
Yeah.
quite damaged. And the restoration of that's going to be through the opposite avenue, through loving relationships and the grace of Christ. But one neat thing about that whole original sin in relation to death is, I think if you pull most Christians, including Catholics, the assumption is that everything started dying because of original sin. But biology doesn't think that.
Right.
We know things have been dying for billions of years. So, a peculiar and beautiful feature of Ratzinger's thought is he sees the world as having a paschal structure. He sees cross, death, and resurrection built into the world, which in a way is a patristic thing, but in a way it's not, because it is conventional to think Adam's sin started the process of death. So, in a way, oddly, it's like Aquinas. Aquinas was just not bothered by the fact that things were dying apart from man. And Benedict sees it almost as a reflection of the Paschal mystery and how the Trinity, being the source of all being, gets reflected in the creative world in that being inherently gives itself and receives. Well, being finite and not God, the way that ends up happening is through the relationship of creatures coming to life, dying, giving life to others, in a reciprocal exchange of gift. So that is not a extremely traditional way of putting it, but it does square with the evidence of the science.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's it's. I was struck by the central theme of Christianity is death and resurrection, and so death and rebirth, and so evolution is all about that. They have an extinction and opening up new opportunities for other forms, but the Paschal mystery is organisms die that creates opportunities for other organisms. And there's something about that that self gift that species and organisms actually become in the evolutionary process
Yeah,
that mimics sort of that self gift of Christ on the cross. And it's not, oh wow, evolution is really weird. It's got all this death and destruction, and Catholicism is nice and tidy. And it's not,
yeah,
no, Catholicism's got death and destruction and rebirth and life. That's what it is, right? It's dying to self and rebirth, right? And so
yeah.
really, I just find it one of those deep synergies there
And it's
between.
Pauline because, Paul says that Jesus is the one in whom and for whom all things were created. So if he's the Logos, well, he reveals man to himself, like the famous line from Vatican II says. Well, when Pilate brings him out, the Johannine irony, as we biblical scholars call it, is that Pilate doesn't realize it, but he's saying, here's what it is to be human. It's to be giving yourself unto death that others may have life.
Yeah.
And it's been that way from the beginning. And so Christ, rather than an interruption or a mere continuation, he is the paragon of what it means to be human while also being God.
Yeah. Well, we're getting here to the end of our time, and I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about your new project that you have recently launched and are working on. This is the Two Books Network, and so these two books, sort of the book of Scripture and the book of creation. Is that what you're referring to there?
Yeah.
Right, and so what is you have a website that you've launched with this, and I mentioned earlier that the goal is to be this hub for engaging creation, a study of creation from a uniquely Catholic perspective, from the heart of the church. So what's your goal with this, and what got you inspired to sort of move on this project?
Yeah. One thing that got me started is reading the Fathers over and over again. You see the theme of creation as God's first book. And I think it's safe to say that that has fallen by the wayside in preaching and much of catechesis. And there are various reasons I think that has happened. One of them is an opposition between nature and grace, and a feeling that the natural world is not the locus of holiness, but it's in the church building. Granted, the sacraments are unrivaled,
Yeah.
but the fathers to the medievals saw creation as revelatory and as a source of encounter with God. Um, I'm more Thomist than Bonaventurian, but Bonaventure thought that creation revealed the Trinity, and had we not sinned, you wouldn't have needed a Bible. The Bible comes to correct our vision. But so that being said, I think we need to recover this because there's a yearning amongst people for nature. We do a lot of hiking in national parks and whatnot. Like I said, you'll have people get to the top of a mountaintop and they're just so grateful. To what? They're atheists. So we need to, we have a source of evangelization here and a source of spiritual edification for me and so many of my students. Well, then why the website? Well, I want to do something that's free for people. I want them to be able to go and have a hub, which is not meant to be unique in the world, but I want to say, I don't care whether you're Dominican, Franciscan, at Steubenville or at Benedictine. I want good material because so many times when I search on a topic on Google or whatever I use, the extreme views pop up first. And so many people I encounter just get the wrong sources. So to do this from the heart of the church, like the SCS website does, many links I'm going to have to the SCS, right? You want to know saints who are scientists, look at this website of the SCS, right? So it's going to try to tackle the topics that at least I know about as the major topics. I'll probably have some bioethics things, but there'll be an AI hub. What does the Vatican say about this? Obviously, evolution, Catholicism and the environment. Get into things. Well, what does the church say about the Big Bang? And whatever is good out there, I want those sources. And so this will be free. And on my part, well, it's very little cost to me, and it's a time investment, but it's meant to be just a contribution to the church's mission. So that's fundamentally what it is. And, it may grow into something more. Maybe I'll be able to put together some conferences or something. So I have some ideas percolating on that. But in the meantime, it just grew out of people asking me for resources, and I wanted to give them a hub.
Well, that's great because it is. There's so much misinformation about that, and there's also so much ignorance. And I think you hit the point that this book of creation, like in modern man, is so removed so many times from the physical world. And I feel guilty. Myself. I'm in my car, and then I go into my house, and I go into my office, and so we're not connected to the world in the way that the medievals were. And so we miss some of the meanings and the revelation behind creation because we don't see it. One of the things I was struck with is like death. We don't see death in the way that the medievals saw death because it was so present to them, and they experienced that in a way that we've sanitized it, and so we don't see creation in the way we're meant to in many ways, and we're impoverished for that, and so I really think that there is so much in creation to draw us towards Christ if we're open to that.
And just to wed it to our previous topic on evolution, we were out in Utah at some parks over spring break not long ago. And we were walking amidst dinosaur footprints and petrified wood. And to me, once you know the evolutionary story, those come to life in a way. You see that as part of God's grand plan to create a universe capable of having rational life and becoming incarnate, that he may dwell with us. And I'm thankful on the one hand, okay, I'm glad that Utah raptor is no longer alive.
Yeah.
But then just to marvel at, you took what, give or take 13.8 billion years to get us here, and not to be crudely anthropocentric, but you did create it for us. But then how do you do that without falling into, therefore we can do whatever we want.
Everyone. Yeah.
Right. That's the Catholic balance I'm trying to foster.
Yeah. No, that's great. And what's the web address for that for our listeners?
Yeah, it's just twobooks.org,
Okay.
twobooks.org.
So, yeah, listen, any of our listeners are interested in that, please go check that out. And if you have suggestions, I'm sure you can email Dr. Ramage what content
Yeah,
would be good to put
yeah,
up there as he
absolutely.
continues to build and expand that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'd love, a conference down the road would be a wonderful thing to get people together to talk about these issues. So, yeah, thanks for being on the show, Matt. It's always good to talk to you. Always learn something. Always, especially to talk about Benedict is my favorite. So I love the work you've been doing, and definitely have to have you back on down the road as the Two Books Network starts to expand. So thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Catholic Scientist Podcast, sponsored by the Society of Catholic Scientists. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing. And you can also show your support by donating to the Society to help us produce content like you just heard. You can donate by going to our website at catholicscientist.org and clicking on the donate button. You can also find other useful resources, articles, and videos on our website.